You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Well, hello and welcome to the 602 Club, but the 602 Club from Earth 3629501, and I am just one of your, well, I'm still Matthew Rushing here, just one of the hosts, and with me is Christy Morris. And Christy, you look just the same as you do in the other universe.
Oh, not paper thin like I'm from the Renaissance?
No, strangely enough, I thought that you might, but you do have a very avant-garde art style here. So I love it, though. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's very fun. I like to go late at night into the Guggenheim and cause some ruckus. What about you?
Fantastic.
You're looking, a little rock and roll.
Oh my gosh. I can't wait to dive into all that we have to talk about here with Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. They legitimately, I think, have given us a tour de force of things to talk about. This movie is jam-packed with stuff. But before we dive in, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We have so much fun doing this show, and we hope you enjoy listening. If you do, as always, you can help us out by subscribing wherever you are listening to this. So Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, all of those type of places, Google Podcasts, whatever. You'll get the shows as soon as they drop. And of course, if your podcatcher of choice allows you to review and rate podcasts, please do that for us as well. It continues to help the show grow. Whether that's in any of those platforms, it makes a huge difference. You can also follow us and share the show with your friends over on social media, places like Twitter. We're at the 602 Club. We'd enjoy your follow. We'd really appreciate that. Christy and I can interact with you there as well as Zach. And of course, you can do the best thing you can do for a podcast, which is word of mouth. Digital word of mouth really helps. So you can do that as well. You can also find us on Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. The entire network is on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You got the entire website as well over at trek.fm. And of course, you can find us on the listeners only discussion group on Facebook called the Babel Conference. You can join there and talk to listeners from all over the world. And last but not least, one of the most important things that if you enjoy what we do here on TFM, please go over to Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM and become part of our team. This is a big network. We're trying to do a lot, and we can't do it without listeners just like you. And so become part of our team over at Patreon at patreon.com/TrekFM. So, Christy, this movie, we got to spend time with Gwen in the first movie. But this movie, we actually start with Gwen, which allows us to be able to get further into her backstory as well as to where her life currently is and what leads her to Spiderville, and being part of Miguel's team. And so I wanted to ask you about that and how you felt about that idea of I'm not sure coming into this is where I thought we would start the movie.
Yeah, I would say the best part of it is definitely when she finally gets to the real meat of her story and talks about when she keeps referring to, but I'm not the only one. That was a great point because it really drives home that Miles is part of this, that she's part of it with him, that no one is unaffected. And so I like that they kind of use that as a tool to reintroduce us to the world and to show how they've been affected by previous events and now are separated. The one thing I thought, though, was that it was a little too long of an intro focus solely on Gwen when you're thinking this is really supposed to be Miles's story. So that kind of took away from it a little bit for me. But I thought that, like I said, that one point was really a good one.
Yeah, I don't know if I felt like it was too long. I think it was just a surprise, in all honesty. Had no idea how we were going to come in to the movie, and I really appreciated that we alluded to the fact that she couldn't save her best friend. But for her, this big moment was her friend trying to basically be special, and willing to put his body through an incredible amount of changes, and it turns him into a monster instead, and instead of just being who he is and being happy with who he is, and I thought that was such a fascinating place to begin this film. And then, I think it was also important because it gave us that opportunity to see how this dissolves the relationship with their father to the point that she would want to leave her world and join this, Spider Force team. And to be somewhere else because she doesn't feel like she has anybody on her world who's on her side. And to me, that was all very effective. And I also appreciated it too because it allows the character of Gwen to have such agency, and there's no way in which I think that she's just there to be a love interest or any of those kind of things. She is a character in and of her own right, and so I really appreciated this beginning. And I think it was also very cool because it also introduces us to the fact that each of these universes that we are going to visit is going to have a different look and feel to it, which I thought was also really special. I mean, just visually, we started off in a world it's surrounded and made up of, and instead of the artwork that we got in the previous Spider-Verse film, it's a watercolor world. And it's gorgeous, So I think all of that was just a really cool way of beginning the film. But I also feel like, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I think it set the tone for the fact that this movie was going to be moodier than the first film.
It does definitely do that. I mean, I will say for sure with her talking about the loss that they've dealt with and, showing, even though I felt like it was a little long, the, band scene especially where she keeps saying, "I'm fine." And everyone's saying, clearly you're showing signs that you're definitely not fine. So, yeah, I would agree with that too. And, I mean, to echo your point, the whole design for Gwen's world was based on the fact that she's going through some serious things in her life. And so it kind of feels like life isn't real to her, at least where she is.
No, absolutely. And I was reading a little bit about the behind the scenes design work, and they talked about the way in which it allows the way that they colored the world with watercolors allows her to basically be a mood ring for the scene. So whatever she's feeling is extrapolated then into the color profile that's happening, which I thought was really cool. And again, it's one of the things that I think we'll probably talk a lot about as we work through this discussion of the film. There's so much thought that's going into every single part of this movie, and that's just one of the things which I think comes across just in this beginning.
Yeah, and I will say, as far as the art overall, I just have to go ahead and give a huge plug to Lord and Miller and then, the entire animation team, because, I mean, both the first movie and this movie have really broken the mold when it comes to how the movie is made and really made you feel like you're within a comic book. And then also added all of these other things that you can't do in the comic book medium. So I do really want to say that they've done something that's never been done before and is so visually stunning and unique in all of the different worlds, that they actually set out to make sure each of the 6 different worlds they visit looks completely different from the other.
Well, and then, we see those scenes in the Spider-Verse, and what I like to call Spiderville is this, we've got thousands upon thousands of spider people, and they all look different. They're all in a different animation style, and it's just, the amount of painstaking work that would take is just, I think, incredible. And so, another thing that I think I was really struck by is that, once we get to the Miles Morales part here at the beginning, about how much this movie is kind of about him trying to balance responsibility that he has as Spider-Man with the desires that he has. Part of that is, him trying to go to school, keep his parents in the dark, and live up to his potential as Spider-Man, and even his potential outside of being Spider-Man. He's a smart kid, and he wants to go to, a big school like Princeton where he can, study quantum theory and all this type of stuff. And I was really struck by this is that, one of the reasons that Spider-Man was created was to give, Stan Lee the ability to create a superhero who had very different problems because he was a teenager, and what would it be like to have all of this incredible power and still be a teenager and have to deal with all these teenage things like growing up and, trying to figure out who you are and then thrusting this enormous amount of power on you and then trying to figure out with who you are in light of that. I mean, I think this movie might be the best in the sense of understanding what it means to be Spider-Man and truly struggling to be a teen superhero, because it would be immensely difficult.
Oh, incredibly. And I mean, also adding in the wanting to have a girlfriend, and then you're split across dimensions. I mean, that's not a normal teenage human problem to have. Oh yeah, my girlfriend's on another Earth.
Talk about the other side of the tracks.
Yeah. So I love too that moment that he gets with Gwen where they're really saying we are the only people that understand what each other is going through, because nobody else, other than her father knows that they are Spider-Man or Spider-Gwen, and knows what all they've been through than each other. And that's just in their superhero personas, like you said, they've also got all of the regular pressures of trying to live up to their parents' expectations, and Miles trying to prepare to go to college. It's also interesting, I think, showing the perspective of the cultural background of Miles. That I love the joke that they threw in there of his counselor saying, "Oh, immigrant parents," and she's like, "We're from Puerto Rico, which is part of America." Like, we're actually not immigrants.
Yeah. I agree with that. I love them subtly, I think, making fun of this idea that everybody needs to play up some sort of victimhood, where like put upon like, oh, I'm so less than, when, you see what his parents have made themselves. She's a nurse and, he's about to be made captain of police there, and so like, no, and their child is a genius. So it's right. Yeah, that was ridiculous. That the only way to make yourself stand out is to make yourself less instead of like be proud of what you've accomplished. That just is ridiculous.
And I like that they go against that, though, that they tell her, they're like, actually, that's not true. So, they're wanting to be proud of their accomplishments and not be part of that.
I think another big part of this too, and you just kind of hit on that, is that, it's not just about Miles growing up, but it's about the changing relationship that he does have with his parents as he's moving forward, and they're having to then move forward to figure out what that relationship looks like as he grows up. And I loved that because it's so interesting to me that this movie is just as much as what it means to be a parent as it does to be one of these heroes, right? And what decisions do you make as a parent to be there for your child and help them grow up in the way that they should? And I thought that was great because, this movie is very much about how do you prepare your child to be out there in the world, and then what are they going to do with what they've been given, and both Gwen and Miles are having to deal with that. And so, here we see again the responsibility and desire of parents, right? It's like you've got the responsibility and desires of like Miles and Gwen with their powers and what they want to do and where they want to go and all that stuff. But then you have the same thing on their parents, right? You have responsibilities towards how you raise your kid, but then you have those desires for what you want to see for them and the fear that, people aren't going to love your child the way that you do, which, unfortunately, they're not. Nobody's going to love your kids the way that you love your kids. And so, and having to come to a place where you've hopefully raised your child in a way that they know who they are and what their worth is and what their value is, and that they can then, live that out and won't take less, is, all of that. I just think it's so cool that we've so much in this film on that.
They did spend a lot of time on the relationship that Miles has with his parents, and I think that rightfully so. He's at this crucial point, which, how poignant it is that we're right around everyone's graduation time of year as we're recording this.
That's a good point. Yeah.
where every parent is trying to figure out how to let go. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're hoping that they've given him all the tools he needs, but they're still having trouble not seeing him as their little boy. And I thought that his mother's speech and the way they used that even in the trailer was such a good moment, where she says, I hope that you always know that you're loved and don't let anyone ever tell you that you don't belong where you are.
Yeah. And I think that does speak a little bit to the fact of who Miles is just as a person, and the fact that, he comes from a mixed family, right? And there are still, unfortunately, people who would look down on people like that, and, but what I think is great about the film becomes more that speech goes to mean something so much higher, in the sense that, of Miles being told by everybody who he is and what his story is, instead of getting to choose that for himself. And, I think they utilize that really, really well. And so, and then, I think obviously this film gets to play with the fact of Miles and Gwen's romance in a way that they didn't really get to play too much with in the first film because they didn't have time for that. But I loved I just love the way that it was handled here, because I think it's done with such grace, because, they're like 15, she's 16, I think. So they're still very young, and they're dealing with so many other things. But the beauty of their romance is that it's built on more than just attraction. What it's really built on is that this is somebody who understands who I am, what I'm going through, and gets me on a much deeper level than just superficial things of, oh, I look good in a spandex suit.
Absolutely. Yeah. Their relationship is built on shared experiences and in this very unique way of being the only other person that knows everything about you. I think that, obviously people say all the time, you want the person that you're in love with to also be your best friend. And that's what they've got here. But I also like that they didn't completely lean into the romance side of it and tried something a little bit different, where Gwen actually says, in most universes, Gwen Stacy always falls for Spider-Man. And then they introduce the idea that maybe she doesn't this time, but that could be okay too. And just kind of leave it hanging in the air of like, maybe they will, maybe they won't kind of thing, but that they're there for each other when they need each other.
Yeah, I got the feeling, I at least read that one a little bit differently, I think, than you, because I think what she was saying is that it doesn't go well for them when they get together because Gwen dies.
Right.
And so I think what's interesting is that it, to me, is a pin in the argument that's going to get made in the third film, which is that, Miles and maybe the idea of these canon events isn't completely what we think it is, because just the fact that Miles and Gwen's romance is here, and they are from different universes, and they've fallen for one another, maybe there's a way that they could be together that wouldn't result in her dying the way that it has in so many other universes. And so that's
right. That's
almost like the first salvo in that idea of that maybe things could go differently. And so, but I think you're right in saying, like, it's made just as much of that it should be made at this point, because again, there is so much else going on that to completely get sidetracked with the idea of their romance wouldn't help this film. And
right.
So,
it's like there's so much else going on that they need to prioritize anyway.
Yes, 100%. 100%. And so I wanted to, okay, so this is something that really struck me. That taking villains seriously is really important in superhero movies. And that in some ways, it's Miles' fault that Spot becomes who he is. Now, not because, Spot was working for Alchemax, and the consequences of his actions working for them led to becoming who he was as Spot because of the Collider accident and having to shut it down in the first movie. What I mean is that by not taking him seriously, thinking of him as some sort of low-level villain threat, and not making every effort to capture him because Miles doesn't really see him as a threat, gives Spot the opportunity to become the biggest threat of all. And it just really reminded me how, no matter what the crime is, it should be taken as important, and the correct punishment for that should be given and dealt with, or it can easily morph into something so much worse, which is exactly what happens in this film. Well,
and I even equate it to just problems in general. If you ignore a problem hoping it'll go away,
point.
They usually just snowball and fester until they explode, It always makes it worse. Ignoring it does not make it better. So, yeah, you're exactly right. It's not that he does what, in Spot's opinion, caused him to become who he is, but that Miles calling him a low-level villain, or, whatever term he used, in front of him, and then also just treating him like an annoyance, almost like he's a mosquito he's got to squish and he doesn't really have time for that right now, then does lead to Spot being able to get around any barriers he had and become a much bigger problem than he might have been.
Yeah, I love that point that you're 100% right in the sense that it doesn't even have, it's just any problem, like you got a toothache, you just ignore it. It's like, it's going to get worse, so I could not agree with you more. And I really do think that that's something that's so important here. And it, it kind of explains in some ways one of the reasons that Miguel and his group are so vigilant about guarding what they see as the timeline, right? Is because they don't want a problem to get to the point where it can't be undone. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a small microcosm of that larger part of the story. But I also kind of think, this is one of those places where I think they just did a really good job of, Miles is still a very young person, right? And he doesn't see the wisdom of making sure a problem is adequately and completely dealt with, always just thinking that, I'm just always going to have another chance, right? Mm-hmm. Because sometimes problems can get so out of hand, there are no more chances left to fix it. And then the only way is through it.
And maybe even, this is just another angle I just thought of, maybe even it's Miles getting so overconfident in his own abilities at this point.
That's a great point.
That he's like, I've got him handled. I've read him from day one. It's fine. And it's not fine. He's misjudging the situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think a great thing about this as well is I love Jason Schwartzman's performance as Spot. This kind of like put upon, I can't see how this is anybody's fault but somebody else's other than my own, which is another, I think, really important thread here throughout the film of this idea of we push off responsibility onto somebody else and instead of taking responsibility for our own actions. And, obviously Miles was somebody who's dealt with that in the first film and a little bit throughout this film. So I think all of that really works so well.
Well, and one thing I just wanted to throw in real quick too, that I hadn't thought about before until my friend Sadiq actually brought it up to me, was we're initially introduced with this idea that Spot is the number one villain here. And then the tables turn and you realize that the real villain, at least of this movie, is Miguel. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true, because you're not expecting that at all through all of this. It's like Miguel is at least looking out for everyone's best interest, right? And then it's like, actually, he just thinks that Miles has caused everyone's problems and needs to go down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I like that flip where you're going to have to deal with Spot later, but for now, he's actually more kind of the comic relief. And initially I thought maybe it was Ryan Reynolds' voice.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's so intentional here. And I think what it becomes is, and the movie is specifically mirroring so much of the Empire Strikes Back feel. And so when it comes to villains, it's like there's one villain that we think is the problem, but really there's a villain behind that, Mm-hmm. And in the way they do it here, though, you think Spot's the villain, and then you think Miguel's the villain, and you realize really the biggest villain of all is going to be Spot, so it's like they kind of flip back and forth. And so I like the way that they kind of keep you guessing throughout the entire film in that way. And I think they just do it really well, which I guess leads me to the question then that I have about the whole timeline thing that we deal with in the film, and how, Miguel explains how every Spider-Man's story has kind of a canon event, whether it's the death of a police captain or any of those things, the death of Uncle Ben, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And that straying from those events can threaten the very fabric of their Spider-Verse. And of course, Miles realizes that for him, it looks like because of this connection with Spot, that his father's death might actually be a canon event. And so the conundrum here of, do we have free will, or are some things just like predestined that we could never change, is a really interesting question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought that was the biggest crux of this movie, in showing that life events like that can shape you into who you are for the rest of your life.
Right. Yeah.
So, like you said, do we know if it's really free will that got you there, or if it was predestined and planned the entire time? And can you change it either way? And I thought that Miles handles that so well, that he's like, I actually don't care if you're telling me that it is a canon event, because the right thing to do would be to save my dad. And also, clearly it's his dad. He's a little biased about it. He's going to save him because it's his dad. So I thought that was such a huge moment. And obviously, he knew what he was going to do, but was put in this situation of trying to figure out what was more important. That, Miguel is also saying, if you let this one person who is supposed to die, you could save countless others. Or you could save one and kill countless others. So it's also that juxtaposition of, is it for the good of the many or the good of the one? And Miles is like, it doesn't matter.
Right. Well, and I think, we learn, at least from Miguel, this is what he says, is that Miles is the original anomaly. Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, though, it just felt like logically that his story might not actually be like the other spider people in the first place. And,
right, that if it's an anomaly, it could exist on its own.
Right. And so then he might not actually have any canon events in his life. I mean, and then too, compounding this question was that, we see that Gwen's father quits being a captain. He willingly gives up his job as a cop in that timeline. So is that another possible change to a timeline? But it's a natural one, right? Like, there wasn't anything forced in that. And so it kind of left me thinking that, when Miles does say, everybody keeps trying to tell me what my story is and I'm going to do my own thing. Well, to me, that seemed not just a petulant child thing to say, but it also seemed pretty legitimate that if he is an anomaly, how can you say that anything that he does or is a part of actually is disruption of some sort of canon? And it made me really, I think what it did is it did such a great job of making me question everything that Miguel does tell him. Mm-hmm. And so to wonder if there is some sort of, in Narnia, it's called the deeper magic. Is there a deeper magic to the Spider-Verse that Miguel doesn't quite understand because he only lives by these hard and fast rules? Mm-hmm. And yes, certain events really make us who we are. But that's only in hindsight that we know that. And so to just say that every spider person would have to go through a similar exact type of thing seems like, well, I don't know if that makes sense, because it seems like, we don't just have to learn lessons the hard way or the same way. Everybody has to learn lessons in their own way. And so I don't know. I was just really struck by all of this. And it what I think is that there is such a philosophical kind of like bent to all of this that I really enjoy. And I'm fascinated to see, what are we going to do in the third movie to unravel all of this. And they planted a lot of seeds in the first movie to lead us to this second movie. I think they've planted a lot of seeds in this second movie that are going to lead us to the conclusion in the third movie, which makes me very excited to see how that all fits together as, one finished puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And I did want to add to what you said about we only know life events make us who we are in hindsight. I love thinking about how if you look at what Miguel's motivation is, he is only seeing everyone else's canon events in hindsight. But Miles hasn't happened yet.
Right. Yeah.
So I love Miles's point that how do you know that this is the only way that my life can go? And if you know that this person is possibly about to die, are you going to sit back and do nothing? Because before, at least, each of the different spider people in their timelines didn't know that Uncle Ben was about to die.
Right.
So I love that Miles is challenging Miguel and saying, but if you did know, you just going to let it happen? Because, well, this is the way that it's supposed to go.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, and I think there's an interesting question, because Miguel goes to another universe where his daughter is alive, right? And then it begins to unravel because of that.
Because he wasn't supposed to be there.
And so it does, again, it does raise those questions of, what is quote unquote supposed to happen and what's not supposed to happen. And is there how it's the conundrum of understanding how a free will and like a predestination work out, fate, destiny, all those things. And so, I love kind of wrestling with that because again, I think that the movie does a great job of kind of making points on all sides here, which I can't wait to see how then they unravel that, right? And show us, because obviously Miles in some way has to be right, because I don't think that it would really work for the story for him to not be right on this point. But I don't know if you can completely then undermine it to the point where, well, yeah, the Peter Parker that we're so familiar with is shaped by great power comes great responsibility moment for Uncle Ben. And so, and that did need to happen for Peter to learn that lesson. It was a really hard lesson, but it had to happen. And so I think, what we're doing is we're playing through, how far you can take a character like, Miles Morales and have them be Spider-Man, but in a different way, and I think that was the whole point of creating Miles Morales in the first place, is that he is Spider-Man, but his story is very different than the others.
And that's the one thing that I wonder, and sorry if I'm getting off track, but it is going to be what motivates his story in the sequel, is maybe that was Peter Parker's canon event, but that doesn't have to be Miles Morales's canon event.
Right. I mean, and heck, couldn't Miles's canon event be learning all this in the first place? Again.
Yeah, maybe his canon event is meeting Miguel.
Yeah, you never know. So,
anyway.
No, it's a great discussion. And I think one of the things about us being in the middle chapter here is that we don't have all the answers, so it is kind of just fun to be able to speculate at these questions because the movie raises a lot of issues that we don't know the end to yet. So we do get a lot of different spider people in the film. We have Jessica Drew, we have our Spider-Man from India, we've got our Spider-Punk, We've got Miguel Spider-Man from 2099. And so what did you think about the introduction of all of these new Spider people, especially the ones we get to spend the most time with? We've even got a Spider-Man Legoverse, which is pretty amazing. I loved. So yeah, what did you think about all this?
I thought that it helped that they focused on a few key people and didn't go too much into all of the other iterations, although they tried to show as many other funny versions as possible. I think if you're going to have any of them mean something, you've got to have 3 or 4, and that's it that you really focus on. So I think that was a particular strength. I did think that Spider-Man India is probably my favorite, because he also is kind of the juxtaposition to Peter's story, because he hasn't had his canon events happen yet. And actually then Miles saving the girlfriend's father ends up starting Moombatan to fall apart, because that wasn't supposed to happen, because the canon event was for, the girlfriend's father to die. So I thought that was really interesting. And then, just even kind of the funny jokes of saying chai tea, you're saying tea was cute. And just introducing us to some totally different versions that you never imagined before, at least if you haven't read the comics, with having Spider-Man India and Spider-Punk was so different, and the animation styles, they really reflect their world. And then definitely Spider-Man 2099, I had no idea what the character was about until this movie, but I think definitely having a voice that has such depth and ferocity to it as Oscar Isaac was great for this. And really the character design, I think that it was good that they had the original artist come in and animate him for the movie as well.
Yeah, I think all of these are very interesting introductions to, the Spider-Verse. I think probably the one I disliked the most, though, was the Hobby, the Spider-Punk. I was not a huge fan of that character.
Oh, really? Hobie?
No. Yeah, Hobie just didn't do it for me.
The design or the character?
Just the character. Yeah, it just was not my favorite. But I appreciate the way in which that he was able to help, in the end. I thought that was really fun.
With the little note in case it don't work out.
yeah, I liked that. And I 100% agree with you. 1, 2, I think all the voice casting here was perfect for all of the characters. But, casting Oscar Isaac, he is such a great voice, and he has such menace he's able to produce. And I think it's really special the way he's able to bring that to the character. It's, I think it's absolutely terrifying. And so I really love the way in which they introduced all these characters. And I think you rightly pointed out, they spend the right amount of time on each of the characters that needs to be there without getting overwhelmed. And so I think that's really, that's such a fine line, because, you want to be able to kind of showcase as much as you can. But I think they also, this is a long movie, but they rightly understand, okay, what they need to be focused on, and to not deviate too much to the cool factor of, like, look at all the Spider-Man we have, because they've got an important story here to tell.
But, you can throw in a T-Rex Spider-Man anytime.
Yes. Yeah.
That one was funny.
So, I did want to ask you, because, we alluded to the idea of that this is the middle chapter, and, it's definitely channeling the Empire Strikes Back vibe real hard here. And everything is darker and moodier, leaves us on a cliffhanger. And so how did you feel about the fact that, this movie doesn't have a specific end and does need, a third movie to wrap it all up?
It was a little hard ending on such a cliffhanger. Even though we know that we're getting another movie, I do wish there had been a little bit more resolution there rather than just feeling like I'm in the middle of a TV show and the next episode's coming out tomorrow. It's like I've got to wait a year. It feels like Stranger Things. So that did bother me a little bit. But I think that overall, since that they're leaning into this version, they're realizing that they are in between two chapters. That was the entire focus from the beginning. They knew that they wanted the initial movie to be the introduction to everything, where everything is still fun and young, and Miles is just getting started and being Spider-Man. And then here, this is dealing with the real aftermath of what it means to be a superhero. And to be involved in the larger than life problems that you have to deal with when you have powers, and when you realize all of the things that were going on around you that you weren't previously a part of. Now it's like, it's not just crime that Miles is having to deal with. It's like possible unraveling of the world that he's in and every other world and every other dimension. We're dealing with interdimensional travel and time travel. It's a lot to fit in one movie. So, like I said, I get why it is moodier and also why it ends on a cliffhanger, although I didn't love ending in the cliffhanger.
I think that it works. And the reason I say that is that, again, The Empire Strikes Back, The Two Towers, there are plenty of stories that have 3 parts to them, where you do need each part. Dune was only part 1 of 2, and you're going to need the second part to, get the full story. And so I think I had no problem with this being a middle chapter and having a cliffhanger, especially when that this ends with us going to Earth 42 and seeing the repercussions of that spider being taken from that Earth to Miles's Earth. Mm-hmm. And, the fact that by that spider being gone, the Miles on Earth 42 is the Prowler there. I thought that was all really great. And I also, I think one of the things that you rightly pinpointed was that this movie isn't just trying to be the previous film. It's legitimately trying to take everything that happened in the previous film and then move everything forward, one-up it in a way that it's not just like, oh, we're just going to be bigger and better. We're actually going to, take the story and complicate it and make it a more important story in some ways, in the sense of, we're talking about much bigger issues, like the idea of free will and predestination, and really what it means to have these powers, and do certain events have to happen in our lives, and all of these type of things. And I think that also creates an underlying question of then if there are really canon events, is any kind of meddling in another universe playing God in some ways? There's just all these type of questions. So,
and who made Miguel God, by the way?
Exactly. And other than the fact that he was the first one to realize that this was the case, So no, it's a great question. And he has kind of appointed himself God of this, society. And
he's leader of the TVA.
Yeah, kind of. It's a great point. It's very similar, right? Mm-hmm. And man, that's a great point. It actually is the same exact thing. They're chopping off anomalies that happen so that the quote unquote official timeline can move forward. And so no, that's a great pull. which makes sense. It's all Marvel. But then, with this middle chapter, we're also left with one of the things that will help in our resolution, which to me was very exciting, this idea of creating a new team that will be most likely not only responsible for rescuing Miles or helping to rescue Miles, but also find maybe a new way of protecting the Spider-Verse. We've got old friends like Noir Spider-Man or Spider-Ham and, Peter B. Parker all coming there to help Gwen figure this out. And I absolutely loved being left on that cliffhanger because if there was one thing about the movie that I was thinking to myself, I'm just kind of missing, it's the fact that there were so many characters from the previous movie that I thought we would see again, and then we didn't until the very end. But then I'm like, oh, good. I'm glad that, we set this movie up to set up all these characters we needed, but that some of those favorites are now going to be coming back to the third film. It just kind of like, they're very much mirroring, Star Wars in that sense, where the original trilogy, the second movie has some new characters and stuff that we need to introduce you to, but then the third movie is really about bringing it all back together, and some old favorites come back, and everybody gets together and we figure it all out. So, I think what it was great at is that it just leaves you excited for what's going to happen, and then at the same time, it does leave you with this sense of like unresolution, because we do want to see that third film now, and everybody's going to want to see that third film, especially after this. And so,
Well, and I will say, to echo what you said about the team coming back together, I was so glad they brought back Peter B. Parker, and that now he's got Mayday, his daughter.
Yes,
which I thought was so funny. And just an interesting addition to the team as well, because it just adds a whole other dynamic. They didn't go the silly route like they could have with her. Like, at first I was worried they were going to go more of like the Incredibles route with Jack, but they didn't. It's really more just that he's trying to be a good dad and also save the world. And he's like, well, right. I was told to watch the baby, so I guess I'm bringing her with me.
Yeah.
And I made her a hat.
Well, but I also thought that the best part about that is that, and this is another one of those, I think, linchpin pieces of information, is that Miles's connection with Peter B. Parker is something that's made his life better. It was, and Peter says this, right? Me knowing you is what made me want to have a kid in the first place, because you were great and I wanted my kid to hopefully be like you. I realized I could have a kid. I could be a mentor. I could do it. Yeah. So, I could do it on command. I just thought it was, that's something that's so cool, because what it shows is the way in which we can have such incredible impacts on each other's lives. And that if we never took a chance of trying to be a part of somebody's life and to get to know them and interact with them and care for them, that their life might be worse for us not having known them, right? That's that would be the goal I think we would all have with every part of our life. And Miles has had that impact on Peter B. Parker's life. And I think it's just it's a great testament to the fact of how much one person's life can have on another in such a beautiful way. And I think that's one of the things too that is kind of, missing from Miguel's formula. And I think maybe, might be one of the keys then in some way to where we go next in the third film, Beyond the Spider-Verse, which I think helps, even the name helps us see that we're going to transcend this idea of what we think we know to something that we didn't realize we didn't know, but now that we know changes everything. So, which isn't that what, human discovery is all about? We learn something we didn't know that changes everything. So,
oh yeah.
I wanted to ask you too, obviously the needle drop soundtrack in the previous movie was huge. I mean, it blew up the charts and was a very important part of the feel of the previous film. And so I wanted to ask you what you thought of the new Spider Mix for this movie. Did it work for you as well as the first one? Did you like it as much? How did it leave you feeling?
I think that this one was still definitely good. I just don't think it was quite as good as the first one. Just because it didn't have as many huge recognizable songs that I'm going to keep playing on repeat. But it definitely kept the same feel of the first movie. And I think overall, the thing that you want is, the reminder that this is the movie about the Black Spider-Man. And so they went with a lot of Black artists to do the music. Some big names, obviously, with like Offset, WizKid, A$AP Rocky, Lil Wayne, Nas, and still wanted to keep that like hip hop, inner city feel to the music, and brought back the same composer as well with Pemberton. So, like I said, I think it was consistent, and I definitely think it was good. It just wasn't quite as memorable for me. What about you?
No, I agree with you 100%. I think that this movie, because it is dealing with a much kind of moodier tone, the music represents that as well. And so therefore you don't quite get as many, kind of upbeat and fun songs that we got in the first movie. And that's just because of where this movie is. I mean, the soundtrack for Empire Strikes Back as compared to Star Wars is much moodier and darker and full of, kind of themes that don't feel as like happy-go-lucky, because that's the movie, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think the music here adequately and correctly represents that, but it does mean that it wasn't quite as much fun, or didn't leave me with those songs that I was thinking, oh, I think I'm going to want to put that on a playlist now. But did the job that you needed it to do. And again, too, like Daniel Pemberton, like you mentioned, his soundtrack is the same way. His work, I think, works perfectly for the film, but it's also not one that I think to myself, oh, I want to listen to this, outside the movie. And but that's also a good score. A good score doesn't have to be one that I want to listen to outside of the film. It's just the way that it complements what's happening on film. And this, I think, does that perfectly. And so therefore, neither of these is not a success. It's just not the same as the first movie. And that's completely okay, because it means that they weren't just trying to do the same thing over again, that they truly were thinking about this in terms of what does this movie need, not how do we make another hit album?
Right. Exactly.
Lastly, we could, and you probably know way more than this than I do, but I thought it was just so fun how it felt like you could probably freeze frame every frame and catch an Easter egg that, diehard Spider-Man, Marvel fans of the comics could point out to you, whether it was all the characters and everything. And I just, it left me realizing just how much time and effort had been put into this film because those Easter eggs, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, I think also just represent the incredible amount of talent has been poured into every frame of this movie when it comes to the way it looks and the way it feels, the way it sounds, all the decisions that have been made with, of course, the animation, because, in animation, absolutely nothing, literally nothing that happens on screen is an accident. Somebody has drawn that. Somebody has done that in a computer specifically on purpose. So it just, and when we, and those massive, animated sequences where we're seeing, thousands of spider characters, it just was blowing my mind. So I just could not give this movie more praise on that front, because I just think that it's truly one of the most unique and incredible things I've ever seen when it comes to pushing the boundaries of what it means to be an animated film, in the same way that Walt Disney was doing all the way back when he made Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and completely revolutionizing animation. I think this movie is doing the same thing.
Absolutely. It's visually stunning, and I want to definitely call attention to what you were saying about the amount of different characters that were jam-packed into the background. I think, of that scene where you first see the Spider-Verse or the Spider Society, and, Miles is walking through. It's incredible how much time it must have taken to draw in all of the different ones that you see, and then the ones that are further into the background, and making them all look so distinctly different. The length of the list of all of the different Easter eggs, I won't read it out to you on this podcast, but you can go look at it online. It's long. And, if you're really steeped in the Spider-Man comics, you probably know way more of them than I do. But, people out there. But I was really fascinated to see how many they included. And I loved just the callbacks as well to things like the live action movies,
Yeah, absolutely.
Andrew Garfield appearing, Tobey Maguire, even making mention of Doctor Strange is just a throwaway line, but was funny.
That was awesome.
It was a really great love letter as well to all that came before it. So I liked that. And the surprise of all surprises, who expected we would see Donald Glover as an alternate version of the Prowler?
That was fantastic.
Sitting in his little prison.
Fantastic.
Dude, it's rude to stare.
Well, and what makes that so great is the way in which that references the other Marvel Spider-Man movies that have been done, right? Recently. Mm-hmm. Yes, they're part of the MCU, but they're also a part of Marvel here. That's not the MCU. And so I love that. I couldn't agree with you more. That was so much fun. And it's one of those things where I think people are just going to have a blast, especially when this movie gets put on 4K one day at home. You're going to see this, and you're just going to be astounded by what you can pull out. And so I think it's amazing. I guess, that leads me to ask the big question, which is, what are you going to rate Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse? So I thought a lot about this because it does have so much about it that's so impressive. And really any possible gripes I had with it are small. So I still come back wanting to rewatch this movie and also eventually to watch all three in order, and really get the feel for how they fit together. So I think ultimately I still end up giving this a 4 out of 5 Peter Porkers, because I missed seeing Spider-Ham until the end. But also, it does have a feel all its own. It really stands out from the original because, we're definitely getting higher stakes this time.
And they've once again blown us away with the art. I mean, the partnership between comic book artists and animators, and the writing just fits so well together. And I have to add, one of my favorite artists of all time actually got to work on this movie, Brian Stelfreeze, whose art book is in my living room, actually helped bring to life Jessica Drew on screen. So
That's
I thought
great.
that was really cool. So if you like the way Jessica Drew looks, you can thank Brian Stelfreeze.
You know, I think that this movie, I mean, I would call this movie practically perfect in every way. It's like the Mary Poppins of films right now. It's 5 out of 5 spider people. Like, it's so good.
Nice.
And I cannot wait to see it again. I mean, there wasn't anything this movie I felt like to me could do better. I didn't even mind the running time because I was never bored, ever.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like all the moments where things slowed down were just the right amount to give weight to the relationships that you needed, to the conversations that needed to be having. You know, it made me think of the way in which The Empire Strikes Back has those slower moments that you absolutely need, you know, especially when you go to Dagobah and Luke and Yoda are talking and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this movie is just phenomenal, and it deserves to be seen on the biggest screen possible. So if you, for some reason, are listening to this and you have not gone to see this film, you got to go see this movie. It's amazing. And so I just couldn't recommend it more. It's to me, you know, there are movies that I was expecting to be good going in. This is definitely one of them. I think, you know, from what we know of the Mission Impossible movies recently, with Dead Reckoning Part 1 coming out, I'm thinking, okay, this is possibly a 5-star film coming out. You know, Chris Nolan's new movie, Oppenheimer, coming out. That's a possible 5-star film, maybe. But man, I think this movie just hit it in every way it could possibly hit it. And especially for being a middle film. And I couldn't have wanted more. So, well, Christy, we're at that time of the show where we give some recommendations. So I am excited to see what you want to recommend to everybody this week.
So I'm going to do kind of a different recommendation this time and just kind of go off of the inspiration from this movie. And that's to tell you to check out more comic book artists. And sometime, if you can, go to an event where they will be having tables and you could get something commissioned. Even just the newer people that are there, you know, doing the con circuit can do some really awesome custom commission drawings that are not super expensive. You know, all the way up to then the professional level ones. But some of the artists that worked on this movie that got to also come back and animate their own character on screen, like I said, was Rick Leonardi that did Spider-Man 2099. There was an artist named Chris Anka that worked on the movie. Brian Stelfreeze, like I said, worked on Jessica Drew. And then actually the surprise for me above all of them was a 14-year-old Canadian animator named Preston, who had submitted fan art of the Lego World version that they loved so much they commissioned him to come and work on this movie.
Oh, that's great.
A 14-year-old kid.
It's amazing.
And he got to work on, you know, an animated movie. So, he gets to still feel like he's kind of doing something fun. I think that that's so cool. So I highly recommend checking out all of the comic book artists that worked on this movie, but especially Brian Stelfreeze. And then, you know, of course, the original people that created Spider-Man as well. So hope that if you haven't gotten super into comics and comic art, that'll get you more interested in it.
That's awesome. I'm going to recommend everybody. My wife and I have been going back and rewatching all of the Mission Impossible movies in preparation for Dead Reckoning Part 1. So I'm going to recommend going back and doing that. Skip 2, of course, because it's not worth watching. But they really are great films. And it's surprising to me rewatching them. Just once you hit that third film, every movie just continues to get better and better. And it's astounding. And I don't really know if there is a better director for action films than Christopher McQuarrie, and so I can't wait to see the new one. Of course, going back to listen to all of the 602 Club episodes too, that we've covered all of the Mission Impossible films as well, so check that out. But we can't wait for that. But Christy, before we get there, if people want to catch up with you and see what else you've got going on these days, where would they find you?
You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd at Bespin Bell. And then, of course, in the Babel Conference on Facebook. And when I'm not here in the 602 Club, of course, you can hear me on my finished podcast, Sabers and Spells, on the Skywalking Through Neverland Network. And what about you?
You can find me all over the place on social media under the name MattRushing02, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, Vero. Those are the places I'm most active. So please follow me there, interact with me there. I'd love to catch up with you. Here on the network, you'll find me doing a bunch of other shows, literary treks about the books and the comics of Star Trek, The Orb about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Warp 5 about Star Trek Enterprise, The Artificial Tango about Star Trek Picard, and Saddle Up is about to return because Star Trek Strange New Worlds is about to come back. So you'll want to catch up with that show, and of course we'll have new episodes coming out for that very soon. And you can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network. I've got 2 shows there. One is about Harry Potter, talked about every single chapter of that series, one chapter at a time. And then you'll find me doing Aggressive Negotiations, which are Star Wars podcasts that I do with John Mills. But thank you so much for joining us.
And y'all come back now, you hear?
Mm-hmm.